Mr. President, it's been 1 month since President Trump took the oath of office. Since January 20th, the Senate has been hard at work confirming the President's cabinet nominees, 18 confirmed so far. President Trump has more of his team in place today than any president has had at this point since 2001. And we've done this despite obstruction by Democrats. Every nominee has received a fair process, as promised, and the Senate will continue to keep its foot on the gas until President Trump's cabinet table is full. Mr. President, later today, the Senate will vote to confirm Kash Patel to be director of the FBI. Mr. Patel will lead the nation's primary federal law enforcement agency at a critical time. We've seen a heightened threat of terrorism in the homeland. Illegal drugs continue to come across the southern border and take the lives of too many Americans. Violent crime spiked in recent years and is still a problem in many parts of the country. And at the same time, the FBI has lost the trust of many Americans who fear the agency has become politicized. Mr. President, Kash Patel has spent his career working in criminal law and national security. He spent his first 8 years after law school as a public defender in state and federal courts in Florida. In 2014, he was brought on as a terrorism prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, prosecuting terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. From there, he went to work in national security for the House Intelligence Committee and then in the first Trump administration. He worked on the National Security Council, where he handled hostage rescues, among other sensitive missions. He also served as principal deputy for the acting director of national intelligence and later as chief of staff for the acting Secretary of Defense. Mr. President, as I said, the FBI has lost trust among the American people in recent years. Much of that stems from a perception that politics has infected the FBI's important work. And it's not hard to see why. In just the last few years, the FBI field office in Richmond, Virginia, circulated a memo suggesting that traditional Catholics could be violent extremists. In 2021, the Attorney General infamously instructed the FBI to work with local law enforcement to target parents who attended school board meetings. And of course, there is the FBI's apparent double standard when it comes to investigating President Trump and its repeated failures to cooperate with congressional Republicans. Mr. President, the next director of the FBI needs to focus on rooting out politics so the FBI can enforce the law, uphold the Constitution, and keep Americans safe. The Bureau also needs a renewed focus on empowering the FBI's field office to be good partners to local law enforcement. I'm encouraged that Mr. Patel has the support of the National Police Association, the National Sheriff's Association, and multiple state attorneys general, all of whom will be his partners in law enforcement should Mr. Patel be confirmed. We've unfortunately seen that no community is immune from crime, terrorism, or illegal drugs. And we need all law enforcement working together and focused on the real threats facing our country. I look forward to working with Mr. Patel to restore the integrity of the FBI and get it focused on its critical mission. Mr. President, one of the most significant accomplishments of the first Trump administration was the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This comprehensive bill reduced tax rates for every income bracket, doubled the child tax credit, nearly doubled the standard exemption, or I should say the standard deduction, and enacted pro-growth policies for American businesses of all sizes. And what were the results? A growing economy, higher paychecks for hardworking families, millions of new jobs, small business growth, higher than expected federal revenues. That's right, higher than expected. Government revenues since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act have exceeded projections by roughly $500 billion. An end to corporate inversions, which is the practice of moving U.S. company operations overseas for tax purposes. Practically every aspect of the U.S. economy was strengthened by this pro-growth legislation. And contrary to what my friends across the aisle like to claim, it was middle-class families, not wealthy Americans, who received the largest proportional benefit of the tax cuts. Now let me just repeat that, Mr. President. It was middle-class families, not wealthy Americans, who received the largest proportional benefit of the tax cuts. Working families benefited from this legislation. Working families ended up with more money in their pockets. Working families had more breathing room because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Anyone who pretends that this wasn't the case is either ignorant of the law or being deliberately deceptive. Mr. President, the income tax cuts for individuals are expiring at the end of this year, along with a key small business tax cut called the Section 199A pass-through deduction. And none of our top priorities for this year, or I should say one of our top priorities for this year, is extending this tax relief. But not just extending it, Mr. President, making it permanent. As I and several other Finance Committee Republicans noted last week in a letter on this subject, and I quote, "A temporary extension of these pro-growth and pro-family policies is a missed opportunity. Businesses need certainty while investing in their companies, and taxpayers should not fear tax hikes due to congressional inaction," end quote. That's it in a nutshell, Mr. President. Hardworking Americans shouldn't have to live in fear of a tax hike every few years. And businesses need a clear picture of the tax outlook so that they can plan for the long term. Mr. President, making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent would protect hardworking families from uncertainty and ensure that they can keep more money in their pockets. And it would have significant long-term economic benefits. The National Federation of Independent Business reports that making the small business Section 199A deduction permanent would result in the creation of an additional 1.2 million jobs annually, with that number climbing as the law goes on. And the Tax Foundation reports that long-run gross domestic product would increase by a substantial 1.1%. The President has called for making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, and I'm committed to ensuring that any tax bill we consider does exactly that. We have a real opportunity to improve the lives of Americans both here and now and for the long term, and we can't waste it. Mr. President, needless to say, drafting major tax legislation takes time. And Senator Crapo, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, has been doing an incredible job laying the groundwork for a permanent Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extension. But there's still substantial work left to do to arrive at a bicameral agreement. And we have to take the time to get it and do it right. As we continue to move full steam ahead on this key part of the President's agenda, however, there are other pressing priorities that need to be addressed immediately. When the President's border czar was here last week, he emphasized that the administration cannot sustain its effort to deport criminals here illegally without additional funding. And the last thing we want is to delay other parts of the President's agenda, like border security, while we do the work needed to arrive at a tax agreement that can pass both houses of Congress. That's why the Senate is moving forward on a two-part legislative plan to accomplish our and the President's top priorities. The first bill we consider will address immediate needs like securing the border and other key national security priorities. The second will focus on making tax relief permanent. The budget resolution we are taking up this week will address the border security part of the equation. And then we will take up a second budget resolution for the tax portion. I want to thank Chairman Graham for doing the work to get today's resolution to the floor, and I look forward to passing it later this week. Mr. President, I look forward to taking up that second budget resolution as well in the not-too-distant future to prevent a $4 trillion tax hike on hardworking Americans and making the individual and small business tax relief from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. Mr. President, I yield the floor.